Hello everyone. How are you today? Good? Did you guys enjoy the keynote? All right? Oh, so inspiring. Okay. So I wanted to come here, and we're here to talk to you about something. So every message you send and show you stream and podcast you download carries a cost to the climate. Did you know that? By how much? Most of us actually have no idea. Cars have tailpipes and factories have smokestacks, but computers have no trail in that sense. The environmental cost of making hardware and using software is often abstracted away. AI is complicating the issue. Artificial intelligence requires significant energy to train, and companies creating these tools in many cases hide just how much. How can we improve what isn't measured? Today's panel is talking about just that. Joining us today are our panelists. Maya Richmond is a jack of all trades who spent the last 10 years listening and learning about the plurality of struggles for technological justice across the world and supporting activists and organizations to untangle technology's hold on our lives and reclaim its power. To bring about social and political transformation, she's currently the co-lead of the Green Screen Coalition. She has previously worked with the Engine Room, is a Mozilla Fellow alum, embedded in the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice, and consults for Ariadne Network, leading the Digital Power Program. Esther Mwema is an award-winning artist and digital inequalities expert, working at the intersection of art and technology. She has over a decade of experience working at the UN and at the grassroots level with her org, Digital Grassroots, which works to increase digital citizenship in underrepresented regions. She serves as the advisory board member of the Digital Democracy Initiative. She recently co-authored the paper Undersea Cables in Africa, New Frontiers of Digital Colonialism. Esther is a Mozilla Creative Media Awardee and a recipient of the Green Screen Coalition. Benoit Corti is a member of the tech team of Data for Good France, where he discovered Code Carbon in 2020 and became one of its main contributors. Last year, with other French contributors, he founded a nonprofit to support Code Carbon and has been elected president. He works as a data scientist at the French National Assembly. Leah Wolf is a project manager at MacArthur Foundation in Germany, and this is not to be confused with MacArthur Foundation, so we're clear. At MacArthur, she developed the foundation's work and on the intersection of digital transformation and climate action. Previously, she coordinated an AI network at a regional business association in northern Germany. And finally, and last but not least, Xavier Harding is our moderator today. He is a former journalist, having worked at places like The Markup, Popular Science, and Mic.com. Currently, he works with us at Mozilla Foundation as a writer, interviewer, host, and content producer. He's also today's host of the Climate Justice Panel, revealing the Internet's invisible carbon footprint. Give it up for our moderator, Xavier Harding.
Thank you. Do you guys hear me okay? Isn't everyone hear me okay? Okay. First of all, thank you, Blessing, for that great introduction. Can we give it for Blessing? Blessing is great. And also thank you to MozFest for having me back. I haven't been on the MozFest stage since 2019. I hosted the show in 2019, and I haven't been back since, but I'm really glad to be back today for this topic, because it's a very important topic. So I feel like before we get started, I have, for the audience, we have to get started on something. So you know how they usually say, put away your phones, don't, have your phones. I want you all to take out your phones right now. I'm, literally serious. Take out your phone out of your pocket and hold it in your hands. Okay. So on the count of 3, I'm going to count to 3, and what I want you to do is turn on your phone screen, and when you have figured out your battery's percentage level, I want you to raise your hand. So I'm going to count to 3. You turn on your phone screen, and when you sussed out how much battery's on your phone, raise your hand when you do that, okay? Oh, I didn't count to 3 yet. You guys are on it. You guys are on it. That's good. That was a little test run. All right, we're gonna do it for real. All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so immediately, they found their phone. Okay, first of all, some people didn't raise their hand, and that's a little surprising. But very quickly, they found their. Okay, so what I want you to do next is same thing. When I count to 3, turn on your phone screen. Now tell me your phone's carbon footprint. Try to find a number. Try to find any sort of indication your phone's carbon footprint. So I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, do it. Find the footprint. Okay, so this is what I want to talk about today. It's very difficult to see any sort of indication of what your carbon emissions are when you use your computer, when you go to a website, when you stream a movie on Netflix, when you hold a Zoom call. There's basically no way to tell that you're even emitting carbon, and a lot of people don't even know that you're doing that every time you use these products. But there's a quote that I like that says, what gets measured gets managed. How do we begin to even manage this if we don't even have any indicators or measurements? So that is what we're going to talk about today. I want to start with a very basic question. What is the impact of everyday internet usage look like? Maybe we start with Maya. How does using the internet negatively affect the environment?
Yeah, it's just a small question to get started.
Very basic question.
There's a lot of impacts. Like we could talk from the very minerals and the earth and the metals that go into creating the technology that ends up in our phones, our computers, servers, etc. You could be talking about the energy use from just sending an email, energy use from hosting this data. But there's also another impact that I would like to mention, which is like climate disinformation and misinformation. So there's, on the platform side, also an impact happening. So we're seeing a lot of greenwashing happening on these platforms. And so the internet itself and these platforms are also exacerbating climate crisis because they are getting ad revenue to promote oil and gas and other extractive industries, meanwhile labeling things like climate crisis sort of scientific knowledge as political information. So you have that happening. But then on the other side of it, you also have the infrastructure itself, as I was mentioning. So running all of these systems which are under the seas, under the ground, hidden from maybe us, some of us. But I would like to push back on this idea of invisibility a little bit, because I'd say invisible to whom? Like, it's quite visible if you're living next to a data center, what that's doing to your energy. It's quite visible if you're living in a place that is an extraction point for lithium, which is a mineral that's needed for any kinds of energy batteries, like for electrical vehicles and any of this like renewable things. So there's far-reaching impacts, but there's none of us are, like, all of us are implicated in it in some way, and all of us are impacted by it. So it's something that we should be talking about and maybe be listening to those who are most connected to those struggles already.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. 'Cause I think, Esther, when we talked last, you were talking about the idea that we say cloud, but a lot of stuff does not exist in the sky, literally.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of stuff is like what Maya was saying. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I would like to read an extract that I find very interesting, because when we're talking about technology, we're mostly thinking about things that are new. Yeah. But I want to argue that this concept is not new, and how it's affecting the climate is not new. So I'll be reading a short extract from a book by Beniera that contextualizes what we're going to talk about. So it's very short.
Yes,
Bear with me. Okay. But I think it will put what we're talking about into context. So I'm talking about this from the African context. I come from Lusaka, Zambia, but I think also looking at it from a geopolitical view will allow us to think about the technology we use and how it's actually affecting the climate. So here it goes. The reason why Africa was described as a tabula rasa, an empty slate, is because, notwithstanding the existence of many African civilizations prior to Europeans' arrival in Africa, for the European colonizer, only European civilization essentially meant civilization. Hence, the notion of colonialism as a civilizing mission. Coming from a different civilization and a different cosmology, one can be forgiven for concluding that places where there were no household dwellings were actually empty, unowned and uninhabited lands. Africa's forests were misconstrued as empty lands. The truth is that those areas, forests and places had inhabitants. Those were the places where African ancestors and the ancestral spirits dwelt. Hence the notion of forests as sacred spiritual dwelling places for the spirits. Colonialism was therefore a double jeopardy for Africa because it colonized the land of the living and also the land of the living dead, the ancestral spirits. Having been described as empty, unowned, and unoccupied lands, Africa was open for colonialization.
Yeah.
The same template is being used today for Africa's cyberspace and other online spaces for which there is an ongoing struggle in order to occupy and control. Tech companies from North America, China, and Japan are jostling to gain a foothold and dominate Africa's cyberspace. So the connection here is that now we are calling it the digital divide, and it's about who is going to bridge that digital divide. But my question is really, at what cost are we bridging the digital divide, and who is claiming to civilize or to bring civilization to, quote unquote, the uncivilized?
So who is claiming that? Tell us more. How does that hit you when you hear that, when you feel that? Like, what do you feel when you see that?
So what I feel coming as a young person from the African context, it's really talking about who is shaping our imagination. So we're currently living in the imagination of Silicon Valley, who is shaping what we're doing today, shaping the technology we use. And it goes way deeper into the infrastructure, and we'll talk about the cloud a bit later. But it's really about what imagination is fueling our digital future, and what is the cost to the climate when this infrastructure is being brought in by people who do not hold the same values or do not see the same perspective as the people they're bringing the technology to, how it's affecting our own languages and how we relate to the planet and how we relate to each other through technology.
I like that question of like whose imagination is fueling this vision that we're kind of charging towards. Okay, so when it comes to like the hidden nature of all this, why is all of this hidden? Maybe Benoit, you can speak to that a little bit. Why, or I don't know, I just want to get you in here, like, or Leah as well. Like, what is the benefit of this being hidden? Who benefits from that, and why is it hidden?
I don't know why it's hidden, or maybe that's us who don't want to see this, but it's also, I don't know if it's really we want to hide it or we want to see it, but it's important, yes, as you said, that it took place, real big place, but really in remote places that we can't really see in your daytime. And there is competition in, but maybe a bit of history why it happened in the beginning. When I began to work 25 years ago, servers were just in the basement of the company. And after you build more and more servers, and so the basement is not the right place, and you add air conditioning, and after you have to put it as they were, and when it's also about efficiency in some part, because when you group the server in the same place, you could cool them more efficiently. In the beginning, the data center was using more electricity to cool the machine than to power the machine. And now we are using less power, maybe 10% of the power to power the machine in the best data center. I mean, not in everywhere. But instead of using energy to cool the server, we use water. And because water is really good to clean, it's 25 more efficient to clean a server with water than with air. It's like when you run outside by 35 degrees. Yes, not here, sorry. But you feel really hot. And if you go in a swimming pool at 25 degrees, you feel quite cool. Yes. And so it's very efficient to use water. But it creates new problem, this efficiency. So maybe you want to talk more about that also. And So yeah, it's not really answer the question, but it's
No, but it's
quite
context. I want to ask Leah, like, when you hear all of this, like, what stands out to you as the most problematic thing about this topic?
That's a good question, but I think that there's a understanding of technology as a solution to climate crisis, and that hides that it actually has an impact to the environment and to people because it harms the people. And this narrative which has been created around, I think, has been fostered also by the big tech companies, but also by politicians who believe that technological openness will lead to solving the climate crisis. And it indeed contributes to solving the climate crisis when we think of agriculture, of energy and mobility transition, but it doesn't happen in an empty space, just as Maya explained earlier. So I think there's a huge interest in promoting tech fixes because it's a business model to promote tech solutions for climate, but a lot of people don't realize that with every click, with every image we share, we actually consume energy and water and resources. And for most Europeans who don't live close to mining spaces, it's very far away that resources digged for our tech here, from our smartphones to the infrastructure, indeed have an impact on the environment around and impact on people. So there's also, besides the ecological harms, terrific social harms. So yes, I think there's the interest because it's basically a business model behind that.
Yeah, oh, go ahead, Maya,
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm seeing a lot of information coming out from tech companies specifically about especially during the peak or the beginning of COVID, they were like, oh, everyone's online now and everyone's using all this energy on Zoom and they're talking to each other and they're using TikTok, and I hear this individual responsibility again. It was sort of, I feel like it's quite frustrating because these apps are designed to be addictive and their business model is about keeping eyes on the app, and that's how they get money, through collecting information, through surveillance capitalism and selling that information. And then they go, and those same companies and those same investors are then shaming people for communicating to each other during like a time that was one of the most challenging times in, you know, our known lives. And so I think we have to be really careful when we lean too heavily on thinking about what an individual's use of these devices are, because I think the real damage needs to be, if we talk about that, we always need to, in the same breath and with more emphasis, point to sort of the industrial players at hand and who is really profiting from this. Because individuals who are talking to their families or their friends, they're not the ones who are profiting off of this complex. And 1% of, I think, the energy use in like the world comes from just the ad tech industry, which is not giving up, is not a public good. It's not something that we need. If it disappeared tomorrow, none of us would be suffering. We would all actually be so much happier. And yet that's what like servers are holding, is these data profiles. So I think, again, kind of redirecting from an individual analysis to a systemic analysis.
Yeah,
is
that's
really
such an important point. And that's a point I want to get back to later in more detail. But I want to hone in a portion of what you just said about the companies. You know, this is revealing the internet's carbon footprint, the invisibility of it all. And there's an added invisibility there, something you mentioned actually just now, narratives. You know, I use the word carbon footprint in this title, but we were talking recently and you mentioned how footprint may not always even be the best way to think of it, and that's a narrative kind of created by these companies. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I'm sorry to like take down your whole title.
Like,
we had a meeting and I was like, I have an issue with every part of this description.
Thank you for that.
Revealing, internet, carbon.
Every single word.
Okay, so yeah, the carbon footprint, if you don't know, that was terminology that was created by British Petroleum, or BP, as a way to offset attention to their costs and industrial cost. And because what doesn't have a footprint? Like companies, corporations don't have footprints. They're not humans, or animals. They're not walking around. Who has a footprint? Individuals have footprints. So it kind of immediately transitions your brain to think in terms of an individual response. And then the carbon emphasis is also very intentional because when we think about carbon, then the solution, to Leah's point, techno-solution is, oh, we need carbon capture, we need technologies that address carbon, we need to plant trees for carbon. Instead of saying, no, the problem is what Esther mentioned. It's an entrenched colonial dynamic that exploits and profits from this. So it becomes a mathematical equation. More carbon, individual responsibility, clean up your footprint, buy carbon offsets, which I think we'll talk about later, which I like to call the carbon mafia with my co-conspirator Fika Janssen, who'd introduced me to this concept. So yeah, I have some judgment about that, not to you.
We gotta rename it down. All right, I'm gonna change the panel name to like revealing how companies suck. That's gonna be the new like. Okay, so I want to focus not in addition to the companies, just how this is an idea that you kind of revealed in our last talk with how privileged nations kind of benefit from all this and create waste that affects all of us, but especially developing nations. Can you talk about that part?
Yeah, so in my work, I collaborate with communities to understand how we can shape our own digital future. I work mostly with young people. And part of my work was focusing on Google and Meta and their investment in fiber optic cables or undersea cables. And when we're talking about colonialism, I like to, it sounds very abstract, but it is very literal. It's tangible. And I would like to share 2 images. Let's see if this works. Oh, yeah.
Oh my gosh, I was not aware this was happening. Nice.
Yeah, surprise.
That's magic, that's great.
I know. So here we're looking at Google and Meta's undersea cables. And they launched this, completed this in 2024. So when I was studying this around 2021, 2022, I was like, wait, it's already being built. So what we see here are undersea cables owned by Google and Meta. And very interesting is the names of them. So there's To Africa, which is like Meta's gift to Africa.
Oh my God.
It was formerly called Simba, but they scrapped that. And then Google calls their undersea cable Equiano, which is the name of an abolitionist who was forced as a slave to Europe. So they're now naming their undersea cable Equiano. And what is very interesting is that telegraph cables, the first cables, were laid by the Americas and Europe during the colonial times to increase civilization and bring enlightenment, literally, to the civilized nations. That was the first message from the president and the queen at that time. And so what we're seeing here is literal undersea cables which carry 99% of our internet. Many people do not know that. 99% of our internet comes from undersea cables.
The world's internet.
Yeah, globally. So what we're seeing is these undersea cables that where the foundations of them were during colonial times are now being taken over by these big tech companies without any regulation, or most of their agreements are under proprietary secrets. But what is also interesting about this is they've built it around the African continent. So companies within the continent will have to build cables to connect to it. So that means they do not pay taxes. And they're not under any regulation because the Africa region is very broad. So it's not an individual country solution that is needed here. But also most importantly is that it is not studied how undersea cables and that process actually affects that ecosystem in those regions. Nobody is looking at that information. Nobody is studying it. Nobody is funding it. So there's a lot that is happening there, not to talk about the effect that this will have on digital democracy or even our own social political identities, as this brings their own colonial or motives, and it's very much private, so it's private interests over public interest. And what is also interesting is, this is also Google is planning to build a fiber optic cable cutting through the continent. And I would like us to pay good attention to Uganda, Rwanda, DRC, Zambia. This is the critical mineral hotbed of the continent. And these fiber optic cables are being built on land. So what the implications are, who will be displaced, what the cost will be, and who will be paying that is all under proprietary secrets as well, and how that will affect the climate. This region, I'm from Zambia, and there's a drought going on, so lots of these things need electricity and water. So its implications will be far-reaching into the future, and right now that conversation is not being had, and we don't know how they're able to do this. So those are my slides.
Those are great slides. Like, I feel like this is the invisible part that in privileged nations you don't see or feel. And you have to remember that everything comes at a cost. Everything costs something to do. And if it feels like something's coming at no cost, the costs are just not falling on you. I want to know how you all feel when you see this.
Yeah, can you put the before slide? Because I have a friend who lived in Benin, and it's just on the end, and so he was telling me this week, but sometimes people don't have electricity in Benin, but there is electricity for data centers, and now I better understand why, because it's a termination of a cable, so they have to keep it powered. So there is debate like that. There is no debate, sorry, but the problem with scarcity of power and water, and it's the people who own the money that could have it. And so I heard that even in America, it's also a problem in some parts of the country for water and electricity and between data centers. Even in Europe and even in France, there are discussions about the new data centers that are coming, and we have to make choice of where to put power lines to power everything in the country. So I think it's, even if Europe has a problem, also in Africa it will be horrible.
Yeah. Leah, I saw you do some scribbling. What you scribbling?
Yeah, what strikes me is that this is private infrastructure. This is not public, and this is a problem because they are setting the benchmark for access and connectivity around the African continent. And countries and states have to adapt to these private interests, and I think that's a problem because commercial actors have different interests, or at least I hope they have different interests than public actors and states. And this is indeed a problem because they're already controlling semi-public infrastructures for communication, like the so-called social networks, and this is infrastructure. And this is, they are already done with that, and this is hard to remove.
To say the least, yeah. I mean, it's just like frustrating because like to whose benefit did they do this? Like to their like bottom line, to their profits. I want to switch gears and talk about AI because I feel like that is the topic of the moment, and I feel like we're charging head first into this future that, kind of like you were saying before, where it's just like the imagination of like a few types of people, like what they want and maybe not what consumers want. Where do we start with AI? Like, what do I even ask right now? Like, Maya, like where do, like, one beef I have with AI is that it just uses way more power than like a simple kind of, actually we were talking about that recently in our last interview. Yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I could share with you some numbers.
Yeah.
Just for example, the biggest public data center in France owns less than 2,000 GPUs.
Yeah.
And that's
GPUs, like
many. Yes.
Graphics cards, like
graphic cards to do AI or scientific computation.
And they use a lot of power.
Yes, but Facebook is buying 300,000 GPUs just for their AI project. So it means it's way higher than the biggest public data center we have in France. And And so the trend is really impressive. Everybody is putting money and AI, and it's really be a problem. Even Mark Zuckerberg says that it's not the GPU that are limiting his expansion, it's the power. And Microsoft is hiring nuclear engineer to build nuclear power to power their data center. So there is really a trend that is quite scary about AI and the power needed to do everything. So.
Yeah, it seems like it uses so much power that they don't even know where it's going to come from, which is kind of scary to think about. Yeah, Maya, when you hear about this AI future, we're charging headfirst into.
I like sort of barf a little bit when I think about it because I feel that, okay, so there's kind of different worlds happening simultaneously. There's the MozFest world with people who are really engaged in thinking critically about AI and who's really benefiting and having really in-depth conversations about what are the specific use cases where AI is working. And I think like the MTF or the Mozilla Tech Fund grantees are a really good example of very place-based, like specific interventions that are using that technology. I would say that the climate funding world, which I've been engaging in and learning a lot about in my work at the Green Screen Coalition, is not having those nuanced conversations about when AI is useful and when it's damaging. And there's a general techno-optimism about AI solving everything without like a lot of concrete examples of how it's going to help, but saying we need to invest because it will save us versus all of the demonstrable harm that has already been recorded, the research that has been done that is showing that it is damaging, that it uses a lot of energy, that it uses a lot of water, and so I'm just very frustrated with the hypothetical benefits somehow being more important than the real world harms that are existing.
Right now.
And AI, so there's the AI used for climate crisis, like to solve climate, but then there's just the rest of how AI is being used, including to support military interventions. And so there's so many intersections of this that are problematic, like energy is being taken from local communities and water that is already drought-starved due to climate change, and then that's used to fuel and work with AI that is then being used to target communities such as folks in Gaza right now. And that kind of action and those missiles and everything that's happening there and in a lot of other countries in the world is causing emissions, is causing degradation, destruction of land, destruction of trees, forests, everything. So they're claiming maybe that they're getting better around energy efficiency in data centers, or they're claiming that maybe they're making slight improvements to the algorithms. But then what's the ultimate use of this algorithm? It's to cause more harm to people and planet. So I think we need to be really careful about when we say we want interventions, at what point, like, is it measurement? Is it abolition that we're asking for? Like, when is the use case for that? So I'm more on the AI skeptical side, and that's just because I see a lot of really bad investment in AI that isn't actually working with communities. And if you want a good example, I would say talk to any of the MTF folks who are here who are doing that work.
Shout out to the MTF folks. I love that quote, when is AI useful and when is it damaging? That's something that like is worth thinking about like every step of the way. What else about AI? Like Leah, when you see all these AI advancements, quote unquote, what do you think?
I very much agree with Maya on this point that we have to decide where is AI useful and where not, and where there might be easier solutions to that to the challenges or to be solved with AI. Because I have been working with tech startups a couple of years ago, and they develop freaking amazing technologies, but some of them don't even have an application. And so they actually invent an application for the use of AI, and that's not how we should look at it. So we should check, okay, we have a societal challenge like the climate change or social justice. Can AI help? And how can we develop systems that benefit those in need and to solve these problems? But on the other hand, also to make sure that these systems we develop are non-discriminatory, don't use that much emissions, and on the other hand also ethical, whatever this means. So, so it's really about responsible use of how we use digital systems like AI, whatever AI is, because that has been used a lot to describe applications like machine learning and computer vision. And speaking to developers, not everything is considered AI. It's like a marketing expression.
Right. Yeah. Big time. I forgot to mention this at the top of the show, but I will take audience questions if there are questions, so you can start thinking of those now. We'll take them in a bit. Right? Like, you guys want questions? Yeah. Okay. Not right now, but soon. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the kind of cascading benefits or multiple benefits or overlapping benefits there are from looking out for the environment when making tech. I feel like there's kind of effects where it benefits, there's like side benefits. Maybe we could talk about that, like the overlapping benefits of looking out for the environment when making tech products.
Oh, you mean like thinking also about accessibility? Like if you're bringing accessibility into tech, you're also like the benefits aren't just for disabled people; it's for like a lot of other folks. Is that what you're kind of thinking?
Exactly.
Like when you have environment as a lens, it's like the benefit is a lot more than simply to the environment.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, anything that gets a developer or community building technology to just think about why they're building it, who they're building with, what the impacts will be, the sustainability of it, like anything that creates some pause and conversation, I think is essential, and it's directly contradictory to the classic Silicon Valley move fast, break things methodology. And so taking a beat, like all of us should be all the time, of like, how am I responding to this environment? How am I also, connected to the world around me? I mean, that's a bit philosophical, but I think it is an important thing to think about when you make something and you put it out in the world. I think these companies create a lot of harmful things because they keep the developers in a place where they're not really in the world, and they're not really kind of having to feel the impacts or think about what the outcomes are. It's a really cool problem. I solved it, and then say, well, what happened to that thing you made? And it turns out it was used in a really, horrendous way. And it's not to, again, put the blame on the developer, but like, how can we all engage in more thoughtful work? And actually, a former Mozilla fellow is thinking a lot about this, Bogdana Rakova. She's thinking about how can you apply like a socio-environmental approach into kind of the development of AI and also other technical systems as a fundamental part of the design.
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of in their bubble in that way, and they ship off their code, but at the same time, it's like, well, don't forget everything comes at a cost, and don't forget the effect that has. I feel like Code Carbon does a lot with that. Like, that's kind of Code Carbon's whole thing.
Yeah, with Code Carbon, we try to give people more data scientists, I'm sorry, it's not every people, but a way to measure what happened with the AI stuff and how much energy it's used, and also we compute how many carbon it emits by computing where the computing is done, because there is a big difference between countries and also the time of the day. If you are in Amsterdam and there is a sunny day and with many winds, you have green power, and in the night it's not the same. And so it's a tool to assess what you are using. And it's important to add to the debate to see the number, because we are talking about AI, but there are many sorts of AI, and even if one sort of AI, there are many models, and if you use a small model, the impact is not so much, and it depends what you are doing with it. But when you compare to big model like OpenAI, last model, GPT-4, and we try to, they don't publish anything. It's also a thing we're trying to do. It's ask for publication of what's happened and which is the size of the model and how it is powered and everything. But we estimate that when you do a search on Google, it does 0.2 grams of CO2 equivalent. And for example, a piece of paper, it's 10 grams. And if you use GPT 3.5, I think it's 10 grams of CO2. And I'm not sure of the number, but it's to give us and if you ride a car for 1 kilometer is about 100 grams of CO2 for a small fuel car. And we estimate that for GPT-4, it's twice the amount of CO2 that you emit when you just one query with GPT-4 than to do 2 kilometers with your car. Wow. So we are going from a Google query and to a Google GPT-4 query. It's really not the same. So that's bring us to what you could do. It's when you could use AI, but when you use AI, you have the choice to use it only when it's needed, and also you could choose the model you are using to use the smallest model for your task. And so it's what we could say about that. And also Cold Carbon is only about the usage, the energy you use, but there is also the computer you are using. And so for this, you could keep your hardware the longest time possible, because even if you change your hardware, it will maybe use less energy, but it's need many energy to build it. So you have to keep them the longest time possible.
Yeah, and my eternal beef is that there's no sort of like indicator, like your battery, you know your battery level all day long. Like I could tell you my battery level right now, my phone's been in my pocket this whole time. But like there's no indicator that this is using more energy than a Google search, that training the model uses a lot of energy just before you can even start to use it. So that's my big beef. Audience questions. Does anybody have questions? Okay. We don't have like a mic or anything. Oh yeah, we do? Okay.
Thank you so much for the panel, for this really enlightening talk. And I wanted to ask about the second graphic you have about showing Google's expansion throughout the African territory. And you see here, the land is represented as blue. So it really takes a scholar to explain and to help highlight difference between, that it's in fact it is land and not water. So they're cheap fake against your facts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do like this graphic. I'm glad you brought this. Yeah.
So it's from their website.
Yeah. So the question really is like, how do you, I guess everyone in the panel, convey and communicate the knowledge that you know to an audience that might not be as savvy?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, how do you do it?
Yeah, so I work at the intersection of art and technology. So all the information that is in this, there's a paper that I wrote with Dr. Abeba Birhan, which is Undersea Cables in Africa, New Frontiers of Digital Colonialism. So you can find that, it's open source. And there's also a story that I wrote that translates what in the academic paper in a 5-minute short story or in a book form on afrogrids.com. So another way that I do it is by using art as a tool, firstly, to get insight from community members using a bottom-up approach and making sure that those affected are in the story and we're getting perspectives from the ground and not just, so it's more like amplifying the voices that are already there, working with climate activists, digital rights activists to tell these stories. And I think ultimately it's also very important to take on an African feminist and also a decolonial lens in this, because that's the only way we'll start imagining what a future looks like that is not determined by the imaginations of big tech.
That part, so important. Okay, next question. Maybe we can go to this guy over here.
Thank you. This is going to be another question about undersea cables. I'm sorry. I came across this argument saying that, if we blend out the colonial aspect and so on, actually using undersea cables as an asset for more climate-friendly distributed internet, because the cables themselves don't use a lot of power or barely any power. So we could place data centers in the places where it's easier to build them and so on. Do you buy that argument? Maybe Esther, but also others can answer to it. Do you think there's any realistic path towards that? Maybe I don't know, seizing the undersea cables from the corporations and so on. But yeah, just what does that argument spark in you?
Yeah, I will answer so that maybe others can take it. I think for me, it's thinking about child labor, thinking about children in DRC who are working to dig critical minerals that we use in our phones, that we use for microchips, that the critical minerals that US, China, Japan, they're eager to get. So undersea cables are very strategic, as we can see, like where they are going. It's very strategic where they're placed. And so for me, it's thinking that this should be considered as a public good. And that means that there has to be transparency in the agreements that these big tech companies are having into how they're going to come, who they're displacing, the labor chain, who is ultimately digging out that infrastructure, and what does that labor look like ultimately. So in my imagination, it's climate justice ultimately, because if there's injustice in any of that chain of command, then it's not benefiting. It's only benefiting big tech's expansion and market. But there is a world which we can create where that is not the case, and where technology is responsive to the needs of the local ecosystem. But I'll pass it on to
we're actually running out a little bit of time. So I do want to get one last question right over here before we finish with the questions.
Thank you so much for this excellent and eye-opening session. I think I want to ask a question with a solutions perspective, and something that you said that, we don't know what the carbon footprint of our devices is, but I, as a journalist, end up using a lot of devices. So the answer for me cannot lie that I should stop using my devices, or I should stop Googling, or I should stop using ChatGPT. So what is the answer for a person, a lay person living in India or some other place, using its devices, according to you? How can we limit our carbon footprint when it comes to our devices?
I like this question because this is what I was about to ask to finish the panel. So this is a perfect question, and take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you need to stop doing anything. I think when we talk about just transition, it's not that everybody is doing the same thing, and everyone's impacted differently, and also their response should also be different and be situated in the place that you are. I think that individuals, it's really good to know. I know that knowing all of this can also feel like overwhelming, and so what we wouldn't want is for this to feel like another thing to feel guilty about, or something that's going to freeze everyone's actions. I think trying to understand, like, oh, in what ways is the tech being designed on the platform end or in the infrastructure end that is then giving me no choice? That's problematic. So maybe supporting digital rights movements in your local context that are fighting for, proliferation of more publicly owned, for the public interest infrastructure and technology, resisting convenient solutions presented by big tech companies when there could be other options, and investing in supporting alternative infrastructures that are being built. We don't even have to really imagine them, because actually people are using them. They're just not getting the same level of investment or attention. People have been building localized internets that work for them in their context for a long time, and they continue to. And so maybe finding examples of that also from the communities that you're working with, and really highlighting that and saying that that's innovation, like that is innovation, and not what Silicon Valley's dream, like fantasy is, that they're telling us, talk to your friends about this and find out maybe they also work maybe connected to any of these industries. Wherever you are, find your avenue to push. From the journalist perspective, like, we need more journalists talking about this. Like, love to talk to you about if you want to write a piece about all of these pieces connected to each other. So that would be a huge impact for us, I think, in this work.
Well, one last thing I want to say before because we're running out of time, but that's on the individual level. But what about the company level and the government level? What do you want to see from these big players that can make meaningful change?
Esther already mentioned transparency, and we are in the dire need for data transparency, because there's estimates, there's a lot of calculation reports and studies from scientists, from activists on how big the carbon footprint, sorry Maria, is from our digital world, let's say it like this, but there's no harmonized standards that make it possible to have a comparable database on how bad it really is, and for that we need standards, and in between all the big digital policy regulation brought on last year, like the AI Act or the Digital Services Act, there's been the Energy Efficiency Directive in the European Union, which actually laid, it's not perfect, but which actually laid a foundation for this standardized reporting on data centers, because talking about energy efficiency, it covered a lot of other parts of the energy industry, but also included for the first time the energy use and the waste heat use from data centers. And talking from the German perspective, the National Act on Energy Efficiency also really clearly states that data center providers are responsible to provide data to the public, or at least provide them to some public services. How open they are, I don't know yet. On how much energy they consume, on how much water they use, and so on and so on. And this is actually data which can be used not only to demonstrate how big the energy and resource consumption is, but also for affected communities to make their point, to have evidence to show to courts, to show to public, to their municipalities that this is actually affecting them. So I think, and adding up to not only supporting your digital rights organizations, but also to support your environmental organizations to actually dig into how these fields are interrelated, because actually between the Digital Services Act and the AI Act, for the data centers and for all the Energy Efficiency Act, there were alliances in Germany advocating for standardization efforts and so on, and that's really good approach, because we need them as experts for climate change and for bringing them into the digital rights space so we can connect with each other and build a community around that.
I love that. All right, I think we're done. Give it for our panelists.
Out here if people want to talk.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for joining us today. Second of all, come talk to us about this. We all want to chat about this forever and ever, but not for too long. We want to solve the problem eventually. Mozilla's whole thing is making the invisible visible, and I'm glad we could talk about that in regards to climate. So thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, see you all at the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, this is great. Well done.